Today's webinar is all about juvenile fees and fines, ending juvenile fees and fines, and exploring the system inequities and next steps that exist within those fees and fines. We're going to start with a national and a state perspective today. Then we're going to go to a local and city perspective. We have great panelists that are with us. We have Dr. Michael Yonas, who is the Vice President at the Pittsburgh Foundation. We also have Ghadah Makoshi, who is a senior attorney at the Juvenile Law Center. They do a lot of state level work in Pennsylvania around this issue. We have Ghadah Makoshi, who is a community advocate with the ACLU of PA. They have written extensively about summary citations, exclusionary discipline, and many of the issues that lead young people to receiving citations and fees and fines. And also Dr. Melissa Sickmund, who is the director of the National Center for Juvenile Justice. So we have great panelists here today. I should say that this is meant to be almost like a fishbowl style conversation. So at any point, if folks have comments, feel free to use the chat box to share your comments, to share any ideas that you may have, questions, etc. Our panelists will be in a very conversational dialogue and discussion today. And so use this time as a way to just relax for the latter part of your day and for us to start to do the work together around this very important issue, but also an issue that someone said recently is low-hanging fruit. This is something that we can definitely do something about. So let's go ahead and jump into the discussion. We only have an hour with you all today, and there are lots of topics on this issue to touch. So I'm going to turn it to Nadia. Can you, because there are people who are on the line who have joined us today who have no idea whatsoever about fees and fines, didn't even know that young people were given these fees or fines. Paint the picture from a legal perspective. What are they and how are they levied against young people? Also, are fees and fines the same as restitution? And if not, what's the difference?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Ghadah Makoshi. I am an attorney at Juvenile Law Center, and I'm feeling very excited. The topic of eliminating fees and fines is really one of my favorite topics of conversation. So really happy to be here and share a little bit about the work that we're doing. So I want to break down fees and fines, this big topic, into three different elements. So we have fees, we have fines, and we have restitution. So a fee is any type of charge that a young person gets as they are going through the juvenile justice system. And in states around the country and in Pennsylvania, this type of fee can really come at any point in the system. So for example, when a young person gets arrested, they may have the option to go into a diversion program, but there might be a fee associated with that. You might have to do some DNA testing, STD testing, drug testing. There might be fees associated with that. You might get probation. There's usually a fee associated with that. You might get, even when you get sent to a facility, your parents will get a cost associated with that. There's fees for lawyers, there's fees for ankle monitors, there's fees for different testing, there's fees for transportation. And so really, it's a very problematic system where every element of a young person's experience through the justice system can result in not only all of the consequences that we know come with being in like the traumatic experience of getting arrested, getting put in facility, going in front of like a judge when you're a little kid and have no idea what's going on, but your parents or your family or your to yourself, you can get a charge associated with this. And usually what fees do is that they help offset the cost of the court system or offset the cost of the, whatever service or policy that you're being used. And so it is essentially a way to get young people and families who are going through the system to have costs to pay for that system. And it's really important that we differentiate fees from fines, because fees are a very serious consequence, but they can be levied against people who don't actually get adjudicated delinquent, or who are just, might be in the system before they get diverted out. That's different from a fine, which is actually like a textbook punishment. You did something wrong, you get adjudicated delinquent, and then you get a fine for that. So it's important to kind of remember the distinction between the two. And then finally, restitution is a whole different concept, which is restitution is generally something that a young person or really anyone involved in the justice system or the legal system has to pay that goes towards offsetting the costs of a victim. So for example, I stole your car and I crashed it. I would make restitution to you for the cost of your car, in addition to the other consequences that I might face. And throughout our presentation today, I think a lot of the reforms that I'll be talking about are really addressing the fees and fines. But one thing that's really important to remember is that young people in the justice system face a lot of consequences when they are assessed any kind of money that they can't pay. So whether that's a fee, that's a fine, that's a restitution, it all impacts young people and their families in the same way. So we really should be, a lot of the reforms right now involve fees and fines, a lot of the legislative reforms. I agree that it's certainly low-hanging fruit, but even if restitution is a harder, more challenging question, we should all be kind of thinking of ways to reform that system as well.
Thank you, Nadia. I just want to underscore something you just said, because that was eye-opening for me, that a fee and a fine is not the same thing, and that you can be assessed a fee and having not actually been adjudicated. That means not having been found to do something wrong. So simply being court involved, you can have to pay for your own court involvement. Are we understanding that right?
Yes, and this definitely is different policies in different states, different localities. But for example, if you get a public defender in many states, and Pennsylvania, thankfully, is a state whose public defender laws are a little more friendly than other places. But if you get a public defender and they do a great job and you are found to be not delinquent, you might still get a fee for that public defender.
Wow, that's completely eye-opening, especially as we think about the disparities of who's being involved in the system. Thank you, Nadia. I'm gonna go over to Melissa now, because my question is, how many young people are being affected by this nationwide? Do we know? And is the money actually being collected?
I'm glad you offered the option of we don't know, because we don't really know. We collect data from courts all around the country, from states mostly, but some counties. Every state and many counties across the country have different information systems. So we take what they give us and try to make it all look the same. And so very often we end up being frustrated by the lack of detail that we can keep when we're making national estimates. So nationally, one of the things that we do is we are categorizing cases by the most serious offense and the most severe disposition. When we look at it that way, we have a category which researchers hate, called other sanction, which is everything that's not put on in a facility or put on probation. So it includes fees and fines and restitution and community service, which often is offered as a way of paying back the restitution. But it also could include referrals to other agencies, et cetera, et cetera. When we're looking just at what is the most severe sanction that a youth might get for a delinquency case, in 2019, about 25% of all the cases that came to juvenile courts around the country end up getting that as their most severe disposition. Most of that, honestly, is kids who are not even petitioned to court. It's part of a diversion program. And so I don't really know what part of that 25% is community service, or what 25% is referrals to other agencies. But okay, 25% is a decent chunk. When I look at it for the kids who were adjudicated delinquent, it's about 8% of them. But we know that the fees and the fines and the restitution in Pennsylvania, that's every kid. That's like every kid is facing that. They can have that, as part of their disposition, whether they're placed in a facility, whether they're just on probation, it can be part of it. And so it could be anywhere from, from maybe 8% to 100%. And because it varies from state to state and how it gets implemented and how it gets used, it is one of these things that's weird. And thanks to Nadia and the Juvenile Law Center for their work on this, because then our organization, I guess I first sort of paid attention to this as an issue years ago when somebody invited me to be part of a Twitter tweet chat thing. I was on Twitter, but I didn't really use it. And some of the stories that parents were throwing out there would just blow your mind. A woman whose stepson sexually assaulted her daughter is made to pay for the detention of the stepson when her own daughter is also the victim. Like stuff that blows your mind. So our recommendations are, judges I don't think that's a lot of places where the law says you must pay. It's very often a discretionary thing, and Nadia can probably speak to that more detailed for around the country. But so we encourage judges, if you have discretion, stop doing this. It's hurting, it's hurting people. Now, our parent organization passed a resolution, so there's some nice language there. We kind of stayed away from the restitution thing because restitution is, especially in Pennsylvania, an important part of balanced and restorative justice that is still the law in the state. And in 34 or some other states, there's the purpose clause for their juvenile justice system includes language of balanced and restorative justice, which was better than the punishment stuff that came before it. And so I think there's, Juvenile Law Center has come up with some, other options instead of just having, especially big restitution orders. And I know that many states that have gone through big juvenile justice reforms of late. Pennsylvania has had a task force that was looking at these issues. I was on a similar task force for the state of Maryland. And there's other states that have been, pushing these reforms, usually with a task force, a set of recommendations, and hopefully some legislation to follow. And many of those have either set limits, so nothing over $50 or $10, or just kind of removing it altogether because it's crazy. One of the things in Pennsylvania that has driven me nuts several years ago, following the Luzerne County Kids for Cash scandal, there was a law, you cannot have a kid in court without an attorney. And youth, because they are children, are presumed indigent for the purpose of assigning a public defender. And so I asked, wait, if the youth is indigent at the very beginning, how is it that all these other fines and fees can attach to that youth's case? Shouldn't they be designated indigent from start to finish? And then all this financial stuff would not apply. The one time when I asked someone at JCJC about that, they said, well, the system couldn't afford to function without that. And that person later changed their mind, so a couple of years later. So we'll see what happens, with legislation moving forward. I think it's, again, thanks to JLC's work, become a more prominent issue around the country. It was just viewed as, a lesser disposition, don't worry about it. And that's not the case. It can hurt kids.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of hurting kids, you talked about this presumption of indigence, right? And like this bifurcation between when you need the attorney in the beginning, but then what it means as you go throughout the system. I guess you hit the mega millions. I'm not sure why there is a difference in, the assumption of how much access to resources you have to pay these fees and fines early on versus at some later point in your case. But what happens when you don't pay?
Well, and that's the thing. So if the bulk of, a big chunk of the kids that as a most serious or severe disposition, this category of other is happening to them. So they weren't even, the case was not handled formally. It was, most of them get dismissed, but there are some of them that get these other sanctions. And so that, you're making an attempt to divert the youth, but if there are strings attached, so if they still have to pay restitution or have to pay for that detention or whatever, happened to them, and then they don't pay it, well, now you're, now you could come back in on a brand new kind of case through the back door, sort of, because this is something that, the court has already, kind of imposed this on you. And so now you're in and you're petitioned and you get adjudicated for non-payment. And that just seems crazy to me. And some kids in some states certainly get stuck in the system for lack of payment. There are some states in the South that have what they call contract probation, which is basically a collections agency, that the kid's no longer under supervision, but the contract probation is trying to get the last bits of money and takes up to half of anything they pay. So it's almost like they never can get out of it because half of whatever they pay goes to the contract probation company.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Doesn't make sense. And most places that have taken the time to look at it, I think in California, they've done some really good research. Some of the defenders in Maryland have done some research, and I think JLC has done some stuff. Many counties around the country, the money that they pay trying to get the money doesn't cover the money that, like they're trying to recover money. The money they recover doesn't cover the cost of trying to recover the money. So
yeah,
it's just,
so it just feels like, to quote my grandma, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. Okay, so I want to go back to Nadia, because I think this brings us to a good point to talk about JLC's National Debt-Free Justice Campaign. Can you tell us more about that, Nadia?
Of course. And I think in recognition of a lot of the harms that we've been talking about today and that Melissa mentioned, Juvenile Law Center, along with a number of our partners around the country, have been working for a number of years on state legislation that eliminates fees and fines. And before I go into the specifics of the campaign, I just want to emphasize how central the elimination of fees and fines is to our advocacy. I think a lot of times when you talk about this, there's a variety of different reforms that are suggested, like, as Melissa was saying, like one good thing we see is like giving the judges discretion. So some people could say like, oh, let's not eliminate fees and fines, let's give judges discretion, or let's do an ability to pay. So if you have money, then you pay for it. And all of these reforms kind of maybe solve some parts of the problem or solve the problem a little bit, but based on what we know about the impact of fees and fines, that judges should never be doing this, that it is really causes harm, sticks kids into a system long-term that's really supposed to be a very time-limited system. Overall, through our research and our discussion with young people and community groups, we feel like really the only way to solve this problem is by passing legislation to eliminate fees and fines. And so our campaign, the Debt-Free Justice Campaign, that is the goal, to eliminate fees and fines in juvenile justice systems across the country, and to take a look and learn and research more about other systems that charge young people for money and think about the same reforms. So that's restitution, that's the municipal system, that's the child welfare system, that's young people in the adult courts. All of these times that young people are involved in some sort of government justice system and then are having to pay money, our campaign looks overall at all of these issues, but our main focus right now is introducing and passing legislation around the country on fees and fines elimination. And so one of the main reasons that we brought a campaign together is because we know that there's a number of organizations, public defenders, researchers, community organizations that are doing this work around the country. And we wanted to bring all of that work under one umbrella and create a space where we could support each other, we could share resources, share draft language. And that is the hope of our campaign. And we also hope that with the campaign, we connect with local organizations and young people who have experience in these systems to bring them, kind of bring them to the forefront of our advocacy team. So I'm going to place several links into the chat. I really encourage everyone to check out our Debt-Free Justice website, which has a map on one of the pages that lists all of the legislation around the country around fees and fines, bills that have been introduced, bills that have passed, so you can look at the language. There's a resources section with tons of resources, and if there's anything that's missing, please let me know. If you follow us on social media, we host a number of events and bring people together. And if you generally have a question or need a resource, we could probably find someone who has it. So we really hope the campaign is a way to bring all of these advocates together and share our resources and share our strength with the goal of eliminating fees and fines across the country.
Thank you so much, Nadia. So we do have resources coming through in the chat. First, Melissa put in NCJFCJ's resolution on fees and fines, as well as National Juvenile Court statistics from OJJDP. And Nadia just dropped in the Debt-Free Justice report, the impact statement. And so let's keep it going. If you were not in Pittsburgh or Allegheny County, we would love to also hear what's happening in your jurisdiction around this issue. Also feel free to drop in the chat any questions that you may have or comments about today's discussion. But let's now kick it over to Dr. Michael Yonas from the Pittsburgh Foundation, who is actually going to share a bit with us about what we know, or again, don't, about what is happening with fees and fines in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Tashara, nice to be with you and sort of with our panel, and great to learn more. The foundation started working in this area based on some mixed methods work and research we did in collaboration with about 25 organizations, including Gwen's Girls and the Public Defender's Office and the ACLU and many others, but really listening to youth and families about the impact of fees and fines and sort of court costs in general. I'd say for what we learned, and so please understand what I'm sharing with you is based on the expertise of those young men and women that were really courageous to share their experience and background with us. And you can find, I'll put, when I finish, the link to that report in the chat here too. But they were really honest with us and shared that, they really didn't make the distinguish between fees, fines, and restitution. Some of the examples, they just knew that they had court costs, and that's what they just said, they get court costs. I wanted to refer back to what Nadia and Melissa shared too, is that the Informa Pauperis rule, which is in the state legislature, which we've been doing a lot of work in collaboration with many of the partners here on this call, to say that that should not be, the Informa Pauperis rule says that those who are deemed indigent by the court, as we heard, if you're a young person, if you live in public housing, if you're poor, those court fees and fines should not be relevant, right? They should be waived. In many cases, that has to be applied for, where it should be sort of instituted on its own. And there's a lot of variation of the court as well. I'd like to, on this day of the 25th of January, think that everyone wants to do their best, right? But what are we asking for if we're asking for a young person to then ask for that waiver? They shouldn't have to ask for the waiver. They live in public housing, they're poor. And if they leave the court with a $138 court fee or fine, or if they leave with a, let's say $300 in, court costs, but then they have a fine, which is meant to be sort of punitive to say, like, you did something bad, that shouldn't have happened. Well, it could be $100, it could be $5, or it could be $300. If you don't have the money, it just stays there with you. We do know from a lot of research that's been done, and I see other experts like Laura McWilliams here from the Public Defender's Office and others, so you all should definitely chime in. You all bring expertise, but we know that that carries with them. We know that from a recent report from the Comptroller's Office, which I'll also put a link to, in the resources that was recently published, is that no one is really being incarcerated because they owe money to the courts. Though if you can't pay bail and that others, well, then that is the form of incarceration potentially, because you can't cover your bail costs to others. But in terms of being a warrant for your arrest because you owe courts and fees, we know that from the juvenile side, and Laura, please chime in too, you may age out of the juvenile system, but if you owe court fees and fines, those stay on your record, right? So you might be in a car crash later, or you might get pulled over or something. And if you owe that money, there's a detainer, then you go to jail for that too. You may lose your job. You may not be able to pay your rent. You may have relationship issues. All of this is about trauma caused by the court system and others, particularly for young people who, in this case, and young women we know of color that are disproportionately affected by the system. This is just one other layer of a regressive tax, right, that falls on the population that is least able to pay these court fees and fines and not. And as Melissa mentioned, and Nadia, there are other jurisdictions, Alameda County, that did an assessment that found they're spending way more money than they are actually in collecting those dollars. And I want to drive you all to the Allegheny Comptroller's data dashboard, which we'll see. Let me see if I can do this fine. Make sure to put this in the chat, but this is a data dashboard that for Allegheny County that's on our website, that's on our system, and you can see what are the court fees and fines, how much money is collected from the Court of Common Pleas, where those funds are coming from. Here locally, this is updated real time, but I want to drive your attention to the total fines and fees still due, right? So this isn't restitution. These are fines and fees at the very bottom. So we don't have the number of people, but we have people that are owing money from 2006 or before that have not paid their fees or fines. They're not going to pay those fees or fines, and yet we're still holding them accountable to the court place. When we think about young people in the system, we can't break it out by age here. It's their parents that we're putting that fees and fine on. It's their family members, their trusted loved ones. I don't want to take too much time more to Shara because I want to open time to questions. But what we learned from young people is that in many cases, they know that they had done wrong. They know that they wanted to pay their costs, but they were stuck either in doing a job placement program or working at the academy in the school kitchen or other fees, trying to pay those fees and fines. In some cases, it was young women saying that their boyfriend was hustling on the side to try to pay off those fees and fines. So we're not really providing a justifiable way for young people to be accountable in the restorative practices necessary in our current system. And we know everyone wants to work towards that. I do want to share with our work, we have Jeff Williams on the call that we provided a small pilot program, and many of you saw the release of the work that Juvenile Probation and the Comptroller's Office did to pay off fees and fines. I know that from our work with the Foundation of Hope and the Hope Diversion Program, young people who successfully completed that program that were then given the opportunity to pay off their fees and fines, 97.8% of those kids never came back into the system. Right. So we know that kids of privilege, you know, my son, whatever, if you were caught in the system, we'd pay that off and he'd be done. And kids who would get trapped in the system because of the fees and fines. And I'll send you a link to our work at the foundation with the Pittsburgh Foundation. Kids said over and over again, it was so easy to get into the system and so hard to get out. So we need to think of young people as just being never at risk, just inadequately served by the systems around them. It's our responsibility to support them. Sorry, I could keep going on, but I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Michael. And you're totally fine because everything you said just really put things into perspective that Nadia and Melissa talked about in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, right? And so I'm struck by a few things. Number one, we don't know the data to be true or the same in Allegheny County, but it says a lot that in Alameda County, more money was being spent to collect than was actually being received. And so that seems to be a pretty big burden on the county's infrastructure unnecessarily. And then you talk also about the trauma caused by the system. Can you say a bit more about that? Because I think that that's super enlightening for folks.
Me personally?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm happy to share, at least from the young people, and there are many people on the call that could talk about what system involvement. I know that Ghadah and I spoke about this before, so I'd like her to speak to this as well. But any kind of system involvement, whether you're found guilty or innocent, whatever, the system involvement, the lack of control, the trauma that's caused by that is long lasting. We know that from many other cases, exposure to gun violence, it's not those 2 or 3 people that were involved, but the entire community, that insecurity, that developmental stage in which that occurs is not the same for boys and girls. And we know that the trauma of growing up as a young person of color in this country, because of institutional racism and other factors, is lifelong and affects all kinds of health, mental health, and behavioral health sort of outcomes, education outcomes as well. So this is just one of those system factors to be aware of, that when a young person acts out in school, right? From a trauma-informed approach and from a harm reduction approach, our first approach as adults, and many of you all know this better than I, but our response should be not what's wrong with you, right? What's going on, or treating that incident or that behavior as the actual problem, but to ask what happened to you, what is the root cause to this? Is it a matter of issues of housing instability or exposure to violence in other settings, and or court involvement of family or themselves? We know, and I don't want to be cliche, but we know of many of examples of, kids who were late for school for multiple times because they're caring for their sibling in the morning because mom had to go to work, right? And so it's about getting to some of the root cause. I am certainly an advocate for accountability, but I'm also an advocate for logic and respect and humanity in that case as well, right? Kids need to be receiving an education. I get that, but think about that as well. I see many nods happening here, and I want others that have much closer work than I do at the foundation, but I did run after school programs for many, many years in communities. And I just think that we need to think about understanding these are children, right? They're trying to find a way to navigate the world, and trauma finds its way to young people will communicate based on that trauma in ways that we may not be comfortable with. But that's our job as adults, to learn to adjust and be compassionate and caring in the face of that as well.
Thank you so much, Michael, for uplifting those root causes. We're going to transfer over to Ghadah. Ghadah Makoshi is with us from the ACLU. And we know that the ACLU has done a fair amount of work around something called summary citations. What are those, and how do they relate to fees and fines? And what are the disparities around their issuance?
All right, thank you for that. Yeah, we have done some work on that. So first, let me explain what a summary citation is. They look similar to a traffic ticket. In fact, they're often called non-trafficked citations, and they're issued for minor infractions. So usually things we consider typical youth behavior that is categorized as disorderly conduct, whether that includes excessive noise, obscene gestures or language, even for vaping. And although it seems like a minor offense, right, you're getting a ticket, why not just pay it, you're done with it, they're actually very harmful and can have long-term consequences. So for starters, they're adult criminal offenses. There's no distinction between juveniles or adults when it comes to citations, as there are in arrests. With a citation, youth are required to appear before a magistrate. They are not provided with legal counsel, so they may not understand what their rights are. There's also no minimum age for a citation. And so it's really interesting when I'm looking at the data for Pittsburgh City Police, and whether it's an error or not, I have seen citations that are issued to 1-year-olds. I saw one to a 5- and a 7-year-old for fighting what appeared to be siblings. So if you can imagine that a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old are being issued a summary citation and have to appear before a magistrate. And at any age, as Michael was talking about that trauma, there's this internalized, self-reflection of what did I do wrong? Am I a bad person? Why am I here? Kids getting labeled as they're being a problem. Most summary citations typically result in fines, again, up to the discretion of the magistrate. And the amount of that fine is up to them. If youth, or more accurately, their parents, their family, are unable to pay these fines, then that young person is then separately charged with what's called a failure to comply charge. And that they're automatically referred to juvenile justice. Failure to comply is the leading cause of all referrals to juvenile justice in Pennsylvania, and it disproportionately harms low to modest income families. In addition, summary citations are not automatically expunged, and a record of the summary conviction cannot be expunged until 6 months after they turn 18, and only if all conditions have been met. And it often requires the help of a lawyer. So if, like many youth at 17 or 18, they apply for a job, college, military, and they're asked if they've ever been convicted of a crime, they must say yes, regardless of how minor the offense was, even if it was for vaping. What often happens, and I know that the Duquesne Law Clinic can talk about this more, is that kids don't even remember these convictions until they apply for something, and then it comes up in a background check, and now they have to rush to get these expunged. As far as the data on this, it's really difficult to get information on summary citations. It's not published publicly. We have requested information from the Administrative Office of the Pennsylvania courts. They have repeatedly declined giving us that, even without any identifying information. But what we do know from the data that we have been able to collect in Pittsburgh and in Erie is that summary citations, and I'll take 2022, summary citations issued to youth in 2022 in Pittsburgh, 91% were issued to Black youth, even though Black people account for only 23% of the population. And for context, I'll compare this to adults. Adults in 2022, 45% were issued to Black adults, 40% were issued to white. So you can see there's a huge disparity when it comes to youth. When it comes to disabilities, there is also, and this, the only time that we find out about disabilities is really if the school is tracking this. So in the Erie City School District, we found that in the 2019-2020 school year, 60% of the summary citations that were issued were to students who have a disability, even though, again, they account for only 23% of the student population. What we've basically found is that these disparities in issuance of summary citations really much reflects what's also happening in exclusionary discipline. So we see the same disparities in suspensions and in arrests that is also happening with summary citations. We just don't have all of the data. So we don't know how extensive this problem really is across Pennsylvania and across the nation.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like what you just highlighted is literally, breaking down the school to prison pipeline. Like, these are the steps, these are the stones that we don't do the work to overturn. So quick follow-up question for you, Ghadah. Where are these summary citations coming from by and large? Who's actually the ones that are issuing them? Is it schools? Is it community? Where are they coming from?
So when we look at these, we are excluding the truancy. And we are just looking at summary citations that they're either issued in the community by our city police or in schools by SROs or by school police officers. So, the overwhelmingly, and the police have discretion, right? They don't have to ever issue a summary citation. These are all discretionary.
Thank you. So that leads me, as we talk about law enforcement and the role of the courts, I want to hop back over to Melissa to ask.
You muted yourself.
All right, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I was like, I can't hear what she's saying.
You can't read lips. Nadia, feel free to jump in here as well. But what's the role that courts play here, especially in creating change around this issue?
Well, I mean, certainly judges in the position of power and leadership that they hold can initiate a lot just within their courtroom. Judges have a lot of discretion to control what happens inside their own courtroom, unless it's in state law somewhere that says you must attach this dollar to this disposition or whatever. They can choose not to do it. And I have seen that in Allegheny County courts where, the judge makes a comment to the victim, about a car theft or damage or something. Well, that's what insurance is for. I'm not ordering the whole cost of your car as restitution. $50 or whatever it was, it will suffice. So that's why we put together resolutions like this and encourage judges to use their position. Our organization spends a lot of time at conferences and in articles and information to our membership to encourage leadership beyond the bench, right? To get out in the community and sort of advocate for change. At the very least, judges have a unique sort of convening power. If a judge calls a bunch of people to a meeting, they generally come. The judge doesn't even need to lead the meeting, but bringing everybody together can be an important thing. Judges may be sort of hamstrung when it comes to more political legislative lobbying, because there are rules, and that certainly varies from state to state, how involved they may feel they can be in pushing for issues with the legislature. But Judge Clark locally was on the reform task force, and I think was very free with her thoughts about things that needed to change. And let's not create these kind of roadblocks that make it hard for kids to succeed in life. Like, our whole goal is to to, should be to, well, balanced and restorative justice. We want community safety. We want to have competency development, leave them better than we found them. And we want accountability to victims in the community for the harm that is caused. That's an understanding. That doesn't have to be dollars, right? That doesn't have to be that restitution. So let's make sure that everything we are doing is working towards those objectives, all three of them in balance together, and not making it harder for kids.
Thank you. And Nadia, what about your work at JLC, the campaign that you all are leading? Does it include any involvement or discourse with judges and law enforcement?
Yes, of course. And I definitely agree with everything Melissa has said. We've considered NCJ, FCJ, great partners in this work, because not only, it's a multiple step process. I think right now, while judges have discretion, there's still legislation allowing fees and fines. Judges play a really significant role in waiving fees, waiving fines, assessing restitution in appropriate ways. Once bills are passed, the judges are really going to be the main people assessed with implementing them. I think there's places around the country where legislation has passed, but there still continues to be some concern about implementation and whether money is continuing to be collected or whether everyone's aware of the changes. And so I think particularly in the implementation realm, judges play a very, very significant role in that. And so therefore understanding the issue and, understanding why fees and fines and other costs are so problematic and are not part of the rehabilitative system that, judges are kind of required to uphold is very important.
Thank you so much.
Those kinds of legislative changes need to be followed with training. I mean, our organization does training nationally, but it's up to each state to train its judges on its law. And we completed a study last year with the Council for State Governments, looking nationally at things like training or lack thereof, structural things about how each state's juvenile courts system was set up that get in the way of judges doing a good job. And training was definitely one of the top things, that along with, in many places, judicial rotation, where judges are only in their position sometimes for only a few months, and then they bounce to another court. So they don't ever really get to learn how to do a good job in juvenile court. Pennsylvania or Allegheny County doesn't do that. And they have, I think, more dedicated people that want to be there and not just looking to go someplace else.
Yeah.
And Pennsylvania does a pretty decent job with training. They at least have an entity, the Juvenile Court Judges Commission, that is responsible for that. In some states, judges complain that they have almost no training at all. Sad to think.
For sure, especially with the amount of power that they have. Thank you. So we have Pam Harbin with us in the chat. Pam Harbin from Pittsburgh Public School Board, who says that she dropped some data, which I thought was really helpful. Pittsburgh Public Schools 2021-2022 citations issued by school police officers was 90. 79 of those were for Black students, it's 88%. White students, 4 citations, 4%. Other students, 7 citations, 8%. So a huge disparity there. Something else that I found interesting that she dropped in the chat is that of the 79 citations for Black students, 45 were for female, 35 male, and unknown 5. And so I think that is why we do the work at the Black Girls Equity Alliance, because so often there's this gendered perspective that the girls are all right, they're doing okay, they're just fine, when in fact we know that they are not. So thank you for that. So now that we have all of you here, I do want to jump into a few more of the questions or statements in the chat. Tamara mentioned something that I had never heard of before, which is around parents paying child support to the state when their young person is involved, it looks like, or placed in state custody. Can you all share a bit about that? And she also says how it affects single parents especially, and they take it directly from your paycheck.
I
I
would
can
say I'm
start.
sorry to Shara. It was Amber. How you doing, everyone? And yes, that's basically what I was saying, because I went through 2 years after getting my child out of placement of still having child support payments taken directly out of my paycheck. I also went through a situation, if you guys can answer, trying to get my son enrolled into the Army, but being as though I had him under a consent decree, there is no longer any records for the Army to locate in order for him to enroll, in order for him to enlist. So our issues now is going to each placement, which now some of them aren't even open or operating like they used to, and trying to find records that no longer exist because he was on a consent decree. So if anyone has any ideas on that one either.
Thank you, Amber. So let's start with painting the picture. I'm not sure who knows. Melissa, you look like you sound, looks like you may have something to say about these payments being taken from parents. And then
I mean, the logic as explained to me was the parent is no longer feeding and housing that child. And so the money that they would have spent doing so should be given to the state or the placement agency or whatever to cover for, you know, and again, I can't, it doesn't make sense to me, but that, you know, this is the law. And it's like punishing the parent because the child may have gotten into trouble. And it, you know, I don't know, it to me, if the state can't afford the system it has created, it needs to downsize tremendously. Fewer kids there, and maybe you can afford it.
Because if I'm looking at what I think Ghadah mentioned, is that failure to comply is the lead cause of court involvement. I mean, has the young person actually done something wrong in a lot of the cases, right? These are bootstrapping charges that get them further and further and further in the system. But Nadia, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, besides that, this is really one of the most heartbreaking practices I think that we have seen in fees and fines. And essentially, in Pennsylvania, mechanically, how it happens is that they use the child support standard. So whatever, you know, if two parents are not together, they have joint custody or whatever their custody arrangement is, the state uses a calculation to figure out how much child support each parent should pay or the non-custodial parent should pay. And they do that by looking at both parents' incomes and then coming up with a number. So what they do in this case is that they look at, you know, the government who's housing the child, but then they pretend that the government's income is zero. So they only look at one parent or two parents' incomes. And so if the parents are divorced, they'll look at, or not together, they'll look at the income separately. If the parents are together, they'll look at the family income and come up with a number based on those child support regulations. So it's really problematic because it's taking a system that was completely designed for a completely different world and applying the calculations. And in Philadelphia, this is no longer happening, but when it was happening, the courts weren't really involved. It was just like a man in a room putting numbers in a computer and telling the parents how much they had to pay. And so very little process around it. So, and really, really horrible consequences that emerged. In Wisconsin, for example, the price was $300 a day for a young person being in a facility, and parents were coming out with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt.
When in national reporting, the facilities data collection used to ask what the daily cost, not counting capital expenditures and stuff, operational costs per kid was, and it was often less than what the parents would get charged. So they're gonna, wait, what? Because again, if the logic is just it's kind of room and board, not treatment and counseling and security and everything else that the facility is paying for, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me.
And we know who so often gets caught up in the system, like Michael said before. I mean, families of means are the same ones who have the ability to get their young people the types of support, mentoring, whatever it may be that keeps them out of the attention of law enforcement, the courts, and the system as a whole. And so automatically, very often when you are involved, there is a certain element of, I think, financial frustration that may be at play in the families to begin with. So it looks like Laura McWilliams is going back and forth with Amber in the chat. Thank you. So hopefully we'll find some resolve there. But for Ghadah, did you have any thoughts just around this consent decree conversation? I'm not too sure about what that is or about the situation as a whole. I just wanted to make sure everyone had a chance to jump in here. Okay.
I mean, Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, shouldn't the court have records, even if it is a consent decree?
No, because it would have been expired. So that requires the court to destroy those records. But a lot of times the lawyer would have that.
Well, let me think. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Sometimes they don't, but they're supposed to shred them. That is what an expungement is. It's supposed to be completely gone. The DA's office would have record that it existed, but the prothonotary shouldn't have it. It shouldn't exist anymore. And that's the problem with it's a good thing about a consent decree and also the bad thing.
Right. Well, another reason why we always say, but keep it for research purposes in the way someone else have access to it. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of crazy. I sort of had a question for Ghadah though. You mentioned about kids with disabilities, and recently I've been made aware of the state having an autism initiative in the courts. Which I have served on the state diversion subcommittee of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Committee, and they had a lot of concern, and we're doing some trainings around, autistic kids respond differently to police and probation and authority and school and whatever, that, don't misconstrue their maybe lack of or different responsiveness to you as being defiance, et cetera, et cetera. And I hope that that's part of what this new initiative is. Have you heard anything about it, or do you know if autism is a connector for some of the kids that are showing up with IEPs that are getting into trouble at school?
I mean, there's multiple. I don't know the data behind it. I know of specific incidents that have happened. I know that there were a few cases in Flint where they were talking about the lead in the water having an impact on kids that had causing ADHD and other things. Kids, and they had a much younger age for kids being arrested and put in handcuffs. But kids were, as young as 6 were being put in handcuffs because they were too wild. They were being, hyperactive or whatever it was. When we look at race, gender, and disability, what we're finding is Black boys with a disability are arrested, issued summary citations, and pushed out of schools at much higher rates than their peers.
Thank you, Ghadah. And then Pam has a question in the chat. Are fines associated with going to the magistrate?
I mean, yes, but it's discretionary. So it's up to the magistrate. Usually there's a cap on some of these as far as like the maximum that they can issue, but it's up to them whether to issue them at all.
I'm sorry, I did it wrong. I meant fees. Are fees associated? I know fines are, but what about fees? So if you get sent to the magistrate, even if it's dismissed, could you wind up with fees just being sent there?
It's at the discretion of the court. Yeah. And I think that's where I think some of the work at the state level has been, and even the statewide Commission on Juvenile Justice Reform was focused much more on standardization of those practices versus discretion. And there still is a lot of discretion.
I just need to say that the thing that I'm seeing is that people think sending a child to the magistrate for a citation is a lesser thing than arresting them. So it's like, well, we're not going to arrest them. We're just going to give them this ticket, this citation. And because suspensions haven't worked, let's just do this next thing. And I don't think people realize that it's the adult criminal justice system and what the consequences are. And there's a lot of work to be done around that.
Pam, this is a disconnect between what some think is an effective alternative, which we know isn't, and is actually performative and destructive. I mean, it's not just seen here locally. This is a national tons. I mean, the Juvenile Law Center and others that have been working in this space, I think, have shown in Melissa's work from a data standpoint, but certainly from those working on the front lines, like many of you are, we hear and see this on a daily basis.
I'll add that most police don't even know what the consequences are. Most people don't know what the consequences are. They just think, I'm just giving you a ticket. I'm being nice to you. It's not a big deal. I will say there was a quote that was in an article. There were a series of articles about summary citations in Illinois, and there was an SRO working in a school that had not issued any summary citations, and they had asked him about that. And he said, there are times when staff or administration has said, can you arrest this student? Can you cite this student? The question isn't, can we, but is it best? It is not. And that's, that sums it up. Yes, you can do all of these things. Are kids going to learn from it? Is this the appropriate discipline for students? No, it's not, right? Kids need support. They need behavior intervention. Punishment is not the same thing as consequence. And we mix that up all the time.
Thank you, Ghadah. And it's also very frustrating because we know that brain science teaches us that areas where you have huge gaps of discretion is where implicit bias is the most right. So we are going to wrap things up. We have about 2 minutes left, but I do want to quickly conclude with Michael and Ghadah telling us, what is the path to change locally? What is it that we can do, concrete steps locally to change this? I'll start with you, Michael.
Oh, I was going to defer to Ghadah first. I would say in some ways that most close to us, I think, is making sure, just as Ghadah mentioned, is that people that fully understand the, not even collateral, the direct consequences of fees and fines, and make sure that this is understood. And I think to continue to humanize and personalize this work, these are all our children. This is all our commitment and recommendation. I would say that, I think given following the trend of many other states and jurisdiction, is to continue to look and assess the impact of fees and fines locally. What is that learning process, which I think has been shown that we're not collecting those fees and fines. It's not a revenue stream of any piece, and we shouldn't think about revenue in this way. So I think eliminating fees and fines in that way, and then also thinking about ways to look at restitution in a way that's truly healing and about accountability, and to think about ways that communities and families and children can heal from those larger traumas. The issues are the root causes, the issues of poverty that sort of more broadly affect. And so I think finding better strategies to look at better pay and income and job opportunity and sort of ways that communities can thrive is where we should look to focus more broadly.
Thank you, Michael.
Got it.
Yeah, and I'll add that although we're asking for this, we would love the support of people in the community or parents, even when it comes to school districts, as we have called on Mayor Gainey and school districts in Pittsburgh and around Pittsburgh to put a moratorium on summary citations to youth under the age of 18. They serve no purpose. The other thing that a lot of people don't know, especially school districts don't even know this, they are actually required to report on summary citations. So the Federal Civil Rights Data Collection, CRDC, collected every other year, requires school districts to report on summary citations as part of referrals to law enforcement, which means they're actually required to be keeping track of that data by gender, by race, and by disability. And they are absolutely not doing that, nor are they reporting on it. So what you can do as a parent, what you can do as a community member is ask school districts, ask your board, are you keeping track of this? Are you holding police accountable for these disparities? What are you doing to address the things that are happening in our school, right? We need people to speak up at school board hearings or at city council meetings and ask what the mayor and city council are doing to hold police accountable for these disparities, and what they're doing in school districts to hold their own police or SROs accountable.
Thank you so much, Ghadah, and thank you to all of our panelists today, and also to you all for joining us. I will say that this is part of our annual She Matters webinar series, so we will be here every month with you all discussing the issues that affect our girls. If this is something that is really close to your heart and you want to get involved actively in making a change on it, I'm going to recommend you join our juvenile justice work group. The next meeting is on February 16th at 3 p.m. The registration info is on our website, gwensgirls.org. Many thanks to you all once again. Have an amazing day.